Welcome everyone to this evening's discussion. My name is Darrel Moellendorf and I'm Professor of International Political Theory and Professor of Philosophy at the Goethe University Frankfurt. And tonight's event is organized by an initiative at the Forschungskolleg Humanwissenschaften called Democratic Vistas, Reflections on the Atlantic World. And this initiative is led by Professor Johannes Voelz and Professor Gunther Hellmann. The Forschungskolleg Humanwissenschaften is an institute for advanced studies of the Goethe University in collaboration with the Werner Reimer Stiftung. I want to ask you now, please, or to remind you to keep your microphone off until you're called upon in the discussion period. Tonight's discussion will be based upon a short talk by Dr. Artur Runge-Metzger, whom I will introduce to you in a moment, and it's entitled The EU's International Climate Policy and Transatlantic Relations. This talk comes at an important moment for climate change policy, as the planet's temperature has increased by more than a degree above pre-industrial levels, and the last 7 years have been the warmest on records. We've witnessed flooding in China and in Germany, fires in Siberia and California, and drastic food insecurity in Madagascar. Currently, the parties of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change are meeting at their 26th conference of the parties, the so-called COP26 in Glasgow, Scotland. This is the first large UN meeting since the coronavirus. So this is an especially opportune time to talk about climate change policy. And we're very, very excited to have Dr. Artur Runge-Metzger with us tonight. We had him speak recently at a conference we had in Bad Homburg, the Bad Homburg Conference on Climate Change Policy, and we're delighted to be able to have this opportunity to speak with him again. Dr. Artur Runge-Metzger is a former director of the European Commission in Brussels. Until his retirement in early 2021, his responsibilities covered international climate science in the context of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and international cooperation on modeling, developing domestic and international climate strategies, including the European Green Deal, the 2030 Climate Target Plan, the EU COVID Recovery and Resilience Program, which aimed at making the EU climate neutral by 2050. And he oversaw climate policy governance that included monitoring progress of climate action in the EU, regulating greenhouse gas emissions for non-European trading system sectors, including buildings, road, transport, and decarbonizing fuels, thinking about land use and land use change in forestry, carbon capture and storage, as well as supporting innovation and modernization in the EU's energy and industrial sectors. He served on the board of the Bureau of the European Environmental Agency and the steering board of the European Fund for Strategic Investments at the European Investment Bank. Until the conclusion of the Paris Agreement in 2015, he led on international climate negotiations and climate strategy for the European Union. During this time, he co-chaired the ad hoc working group preparing for the Paris Agreement in the period of 2013 and 2014, and he served as vice president of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Bureau from 2010 to 2012. Until mid-2003, he occupied various commissions assignments in Sarajevo, Brussels, and Harare. He holds a doctorate degree in agricultural economics. We're delighted to have Dr. Artur Runge-Metzger speak to us this evening. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Darrel, for the introduction and for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to come back so quickly in order to give a talk on the EU and also climate policies and transatlantic relations. I've prepared a few slides, which I will try to get onto the screen. I hope that everybody can see. And what I want to do is very quickly, can you see it?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Very quickly go through some basic facts that are important to know in order to understand a little bit the context in terms of climate policies. But I'm not going to explain the entire climate science. I think, Darrel, you did a good job in telling everybody kind of what is happening with the world and what are the adverse effects of climate change. Then I want to talk about the development of domestic climate policies in Europe and also in the US, and highlight kind of the differences and the commonalities, and also talk about cooperation between the US and the EU, and then move to international climate policy. So what's happening at the COP, for instance, but not only. I think the field is much wider, and I will come to a couple of conclusions, and then I'm going to look forward to the debate. First, let's start with public awareness. How do the US and Europe fare, and what are people ready to do when it comes to tackling climate change? And I think what we see is, if you see the numbers here, this comes from one of the Pew research that was done earlier this year. You see quite some significant support in the United States. You see here 74% of people who are ready to do things on climate. And you see similar numbers and even higher numbers in Europe. And I think that is something that is a new development also for the United States. If you would go back like 20 years or even 10 years, the numbers would be much smaller. While in Europe, numbers have always been very high. Even in our questionnaires we did through the Eurobarometer, there was always a very strong support for climate policies. And I think what we have seen in recent years is that really the street is pushing the European politicians. The Fridays for Future movement has really made a difference in terms of accelerating climate policy. And this also is reflected when you look at the system in terms of the constitution of the European Parliament, where I think we in Europe have enjoyed for a long time a strong majority in favor of strong climate policies. When you look at the council side, I think that was a more mixed story, and it took quite some time to really get to the place where we are today in terms of climate policies. In the US, on the contrary, I think it's always a very difficult political situation, and it has evolved in a very different way. Because if I look back when I started in climate negotiations at the end of 1998, you could still see a kind of good support both on the Republican side, of course not that strong, and on the Democratic side. So it was a bipartisan issue at a certain point in time. But that has changed over the last years, and it has become more an issue that is supported by the Democrats than by the Republicans. It's even kind of one of the issues where they would divide each other in terms of saying, okay, I'm a Republican, so therefore my support for climate is not that strong. And the few people I have known from the Republican side, they are really struggling to make themselves heard in the Republican Party in the US on climate change. Some tried to join the Trump administration, but many of them left even during the Trump administration because it was impossible for them to make headway. I think that's the kind of the basis on which you are looking forward. Now, looking at some of the physical facts, if you look back to the 70s and you look at absolute emissions, the US and Europe were about similar. We were the largest emitters worldwide, but that changed over time. And that started changing with the oil crisis, where in Europe, Europe is a main importer of oil. It became so expensive that we had to do energy savings. So emissions, as a result, were also going down since 1978, and they have, or 1979, and since then they have been going down. You see that here on the green line, while the US emissions continued to grow until the year 2005. And I think that is something where the physical differences are quite big between Europe and the United States. Over the last years, we also see in the US emissions going down. But one of the common challenges we see is China. China was a small emitter in the year 1970. It could clearly call itself a developing country, but you see, as of the year 2000, emissions have been rising steeply, and that is combined with an enormous economic growth that China has seen. And China has become the largest emitter already about 15 years ago. And that was also the reason why the discussion with China changed quite dramatically over the last 15 years. We can also look at the numbers in terms of per capita emissions. And here you see that the US has very high per capita emissions. And that's something that is always going to fly into the face of the United States when it comes to the international negotiations. The European per capita emissions have always been much lower than the American ones. There's many differences and reasons for that. As I said, Europe was much more dependent on imports of energy. So therefore, energy was used in a much more efficient manner compared to the United States. But what's also remarkable is looking again at China, which had about a ton of carbon dioxide emissions in the year 1970, but already in the year 2010, their emissions per capita were rising above the European per capita emissions in terms of CO2. And that, of course, has also an impact on the conversation with those partners. Finally, a third issue one also needs to look at is in terms of the intensity of fossil carbon use. And that is something that is important if you want to understand how the EU and the US are interacting with China, because you will see that China, in that respect, is still the most inefficient economy worldwide. And even if you can look at the graph on the right-hand side down there, much lower efficiency than India, for instance. Over time, I think in terms of intensity of fossil carbon use, all have become much better, which just shows the technological progress that has been happening around the world. Now, how is that being turned into the visions for EU-US climate policies? And I'm looking here at the years 2030 to 2050 and what the current visions are. So in Europe, last year, the European climate law was adopted, and it fixes that the EU wants to become climate neutral in the year 2050. That means net zero greenhouse gas emissions in the year 2050. And therefore, in the year 2030, the EU will have to reach minus 55% compared to 1990 in terms of emission reductions. The Biden administration has just presented its plan until 2050 2 days ago at the Glasgow conference. And it's very similar to the ambition that Europe has put onto the table. It also says net zero in the year 2050 and a reduction of 50 to 52% below 2005 levels in the year 2030. So in that respect, I think today, the European Union and the United States are quite similar in terms of their ambition on climate policies. But the big question, of course, is this going to happen? Yes or no? And how is this going to be implemented? And here you can see that in terms of domestic policy responses, we have quite different approaches. In Europe, you have a very strong regulatory approach. And just before the summer break, Europe put onto the table what is called Fit for 55 package that has 14 different pieces of legislation that are proposed to the Council and the European Parliament. It covers emissions trading, it covers transport, it covers energy, it covers taxation and trade. And that is the way kind of Europe is trying to implement its climate policies already since the year 2005. And so far, that has been successful because all the targets that were set during 2008 to 2012, but also 2020, were reached, and the legislation has helped to reach those targets. On top of this, of course, there comes EU financial support. And I'm not going to the individual instruments. Here, COVID recovery is one of the big programs with 720 billion euros in the coming 4 to 5 years that is going to be spent. And then on top of that, of course, member states have their own climate policies. And if you add them up, you get to something like 2,500 policies and measures. And at the member state level, in particular, taxation is an important policy. On the US side, you see a much different approach. And the reason for that is in the political system and in terms of the majorities you can master in the United States. So at the federal level, you are relatively weak from the side of the US. Kind of most of the legislative advances are still done on the basis of the Clean Air Act, which is more than 20 years old. And even when the US started to regulate carbon dioxide under the Clean Air Act, some cases were brought to court, and the US was disallowed for quite some time to even capture carbon dioxide under the Clean Air Act. So the US had to revert mainly to financial instruments, tax breaks, and financial support. And I will talk about that more in a few minutes. But then, of course, what we have seen over the last years is kind of a constant change of US government, flipping from a democratic government or democratic government to a Republican government. And every time you had a Republican government coming in, you lost support to climate policies. And the worst, I think, was the Trump administration, where many of the legislative acts that were tried under or that were administered under the Obama administration, like the Clean Coal Rule, were even reversed, and many decisions were reversed. Because many of the decisions were done already under the Obama administration under executive order, because it was impossible to master majorities for legislation in the Senate. For instance, the Waxman-Markey bill, which would have brought emissions trading to the United States. It was tried for 2-3 years, but then Obama in his last term had to drop it because it was impossible to find a majority in the Senate for that piece of legislation. So that also means that the states and also cities become more important in the fight against climate change. And what you will have seen during the last 4 years is under the Trump administration, particularly the states have been forming an alliance which covers particularly the East Coast and the West Coast, but also Texas in the middle, and it's Arizona in the middle, and some other states and around the Great Lakes, to force and put forward progressive climate policies in the United States. Another part that is important on the US side is the role of philanthropy. There is so much money being spent by rich people in the United States and increasingly on climate change over the last years, that this has really changed the debate also in the United States and has led to much more action at the state level, but also at the level of cities. And in terms of bringing forward or helping in policy development, academia and think tanks play a much bigger role than they do in Europe. And I think it's kind of all the major universities have major programs on climate. Many of them will say, put a price on carbon, but it's hard to administer by the administration. And then also NGOs play a much more significant role, I think, in the United States when it comes to practical implementation. all is about mobilizing investment in Europe, particularly through regulatory environment, and in the US through direct programs. And that is what the Biden administration is struggling to do at the present point in time. From the initial proposals, President Biden had to make major changes and major cuts in his proposals. It's now down to $555 billion US dollars, which is a huge amount of money. And it goes into industry and into the energy sector in particular, but also looks at agriculture. Still, whether this program is going to deliver, we will have to see. But the same question mark, of course, we can put onto the European program because it hinges on the adoption of all the legislation that's on the table now in Council and Parliament. And you cannot expect that to happen before, I think, the next 18 to 24 months, because it's 3,500 pages of legislation that Parliament will have to go through. And that's not going to be an easy task. And you will have seen in the public, there's already certain parts of the legislation that are being disputed. So I think it will be quite an interesting ride through the institutions in Europe as well in the coming years. What is also important, I should mention, is that, of course, EU and US climate policy have not developed independently of each other. There's a lot of exchange, and there was a lot of exchange in the past. If you think of the European emissions trading system, that was inspired directly by the US sulfur trading system that was established under the Clean Air Act. And a lot of the kind of features of the EU ETS were built on the experiences of the sulfur program. And the same is true in terms of the cooperation at the state level. California and Baden-Württemberg is one example, and also with the cities. There's a huge program, the C40, where European and American cities are coming together in order to work together very closely. And finally, US philanthropy is also reaching into Europe. They're financing the European Climate Foundation and channel money through the European Climate Foundation into Europe, and also to foster the climate debate. So in that respect, transatlantic relations are very broad when it comes to climate, and they rely very much on all the linkages that are happening outside the federal level. The federal level depends very much on who is at the helm of the administration. And business, I should not forget. And here, of course, we benefit from the fact that many American-based companies and many European-based companies have their factories and their outlets in the different constituencies. And I could go through many technologies here on how EU-US cooperation in practice in the corporate world is working. One good example that is mentioned here is on vehicle efficiency standards, where you can see on the graph how these standards have been driving down vehicle emissions over time, and you see how they have been working hand in hand. It's not exactly the same legislation. In Europe, we legislate carbon dioxide emissions. In the United States, it's the fuel consumption standards that are there, and that is driven very much by California. And we have been working very closely with California, but also with our colleagues at the EPA when it comes to having coordinated approaches on vehicle efficiency standards. And I think that has fostered industry to really innovate. And I think Tesla on the US side is a good example where kind of a big jump was made, moving out of the internal combustion engine towards electric mobility. And European companies are now forced through the legislation to follow suit. The same is true for renewable energy, where Europe took the lead for many, many years. And for instance, General Electric was developing their wind business in Europe before they were taking it to the United States when conditions were right on that side. So in terms of business cooperation, there is a lot that is being done. I think it's in the mutual benefit of both sides. Now let's come to international negotiations. And here, because this is something that is being led from the federal level, so by the US administration, you see the United States since the beginning, since 1992, hopping in and hopping off the international negotiations track. The US was instrumental to get to the UNFCCC, to the convention. The US was instrumental in getting to the Kyoto Protocol and accepting even there a -7% target. But in 2001, the US was walking away from the Kyoto Protocol under the Bush administration, and it took quite some time to pick up the pieces. At least President Bush came back to the negotiation table with a lot of pressure from his European peers. Tony Blair, Angela Merkel, Sarkozy were all instrumental in that. And it only happened when Europe started also inviting the +5, because that is one of the big stumbling blocks on the climate debate since the beginning. And that was also the reason why the Kyoto Protocol was never ratified by the US, because the Kyoto Protocol only had commitments for industrialized countries, but not for developing countries. And when Tony Blair and also Angela Merkel invited to the G7 summits in 2005 and 6, also Mexico, China, India, South Africa, the big emitter, and Brazil, of course, the big emitters, then a new conversation started. And that in the end led to 2009, the Copenhagen Accord, which was not adopted and failed in the last night. But then eventually we got to the Paris Agreement in 2015. But again, that was only possible because of the change of government in the year 2009 and President Obama coming in. And that made it possible to have the US fully engaged in the international negotiation process. And I think the EU and the US are very much aligned in many things. But on certain things, we are also not aligned with each other. We are aligned definitely when it comes to science, when it comes to transparency. But when it comes to reduction commitments and the form of those commitments, we had always had very different views. The EU is always on the side of having legally binding, internationally legally binding commitments, while that is something that goes a step too far for the US. And the reason, again, is simple, because if you have legally binding commitments, it is something that will have to be passed through Congress and Senate. And there, I think it's even for the Obama administration, it would have been difficult to master the right numbers of votes in Senate and probably even in Congress. So therefore, the Paris Agreement in the end doesn't have an annex with all the commitments listed, and there is no hard compliance attached to it. That is something the EU lost during the negotiations, but it was the only way to keep the US on board. And not only the US, I have to say, also China and India were very strong on that point, that they wanted to have a pledge and review system and not something that is hard. In terms of compliance, on climate finance, of course, the US is making contributions, but again, the US is not a reliable partner on that, because as soon as the Trump administration came in, President Trump did not care about the $100 billion US, a commitment that was made already in the year 2009 towards the developing countries. While on the European side, we take it very serious, and I think we are even ready to pay a little more on that. Other areas where we had big confrontations with the United States was, for instance, on aviation, where the European Union tried to move forward unilaterally by including international flights into the European Union emissions trading system. And then the US was mounting the barricades together with China and all other big developing countries in the Civil Aviation Organization. And we had to put a moratorium at the end. But what it at least started was a serious discussion under ICAO, which are coming to a close also in the coming months, with what we would say, I think, as Europeans, not a very strong commitment under ICAO, but at least it is a first step after ICAO had not been pushing ahead very strongly. Interestingly, also over the last days, you will have heard that the US, together with Denmark and other countries, announcing to make similar moves forward under the International Maritime Organization, another area, shipping emissions in the world that are not really covered under the UN negotiations. So also something where more needs to be done and where the current administration seems to be ready to move ahead in the multilateral fora. Finally, a few thoughts maybe on trade before I close. And I put it with a question mark. And it's again, the reason is that everything that is related to trade hinges upon action of the administration. And that depends very much on, again, who's at the helm of the administration. What we have seen over the recent months since Biden has come into office is that the EU and the US have agreed to create a trade and technology council, which will deal, for instance, with preferential trade for climate-friendly goods. We have seen in the last days the US-EU agreement on steel and aluminium that is going to revert the duties that have been put on steel and aluminium by the Trump administration. And that also has a little link to climate because it says that it should be clean steel that should come in products from Europe to the United States. But the details of that deal are not yet known, and I presume that some of the stuff is still going to be worked out. A third element here that has come to the table is part of the EU package from July this year under the Fit for 55. And that is related to the fact that in Europe, carbon prices have been moving up. You see it here on the left-hand side in the graph over the last years, in particular the last months, to around 60 euros per ton of carbon dioxide. And that makes many of the energy-intensive industries no longer competitive in Europe. And there's a risk that the companies will move their factories out of Europe for that reason. And that means also moving the emissions out of Europe into areas where you have less stringent legislation, so where emissions could even be higher. So as a climate policy, it would render the EU emissions trading system ineffective if that would happen. So in order to counter this, there's a proposal for the first time on a carbon border adjustment mechanism. And the first reaction of the US was, of course, quite a negative reaction towards the EU, like also from other trading partners, more or less saying, haven't you learned your lesson with the Europe's aviation proposal? So this is also something that is going to be discussed. The interesting, or the only interesting thing on that side is that at least under the G20, there was a discussion among finance ministers, and there was an agreement to continue to discuss carbon leakage issues and how they could be addressed, maybe in an international context. But there's more common challenges we face when we move towards a cleaner world. One of those is, for instance, fair access to critical raw materials. And here again, I think we are faced with a China that is growing still very fast, which even, I think, during the COVID pandemic showed that it was able to reap an economic advantage out of that crisis, because China was much more quickly coming back, falling back on its feet and controlling COVID in China. So that is where I think the EU and the US have a common challenge in the coming years. Also seen when you look at the geopolitics of China wanting to become kind of the master of the universe. I think that, of course, is also something that is going to affect our relations between the US and the EU in the coming years. So in terms of conclusions, as I said, public awareness, we see on both sides of the Atlantic, it is growing, but it doesn't manifest itself in the US yet fully in the political system. We have quite different approaches in terms of policies, but that is the reason for this is the differences in the political systems, in the decision-making systems, and in the politics on both sides of the Atlantics. The US and the EU are both expected to demonstrate international leadership in climate policies, but the US engagement has been, as I said, hop on, hop off. And I think with yesterday's elections in the US, I think the question is also for us in Europe, for how long and how strong is the Biden administration going to be in the coming months and in the coming years, and what's going to happen during the midterms next year. So that means that what some people call the track 2 engagement between Europe and the US is continued to remain a very important pillar of transatlantic relations. Maybe even it's more important than the relations we have at federal level, at least at times that is true. In terms of fostering innovation in an open market, I think that is something that is mutually beneficial. And I think where EU and US business are pushing into the same direction. When it comes to international climate policies, I think we both are on the same page when it comes to ensuring broad participation. And that is not only China, that is many more countries, of course, first and foremost the G20, but then also the other emerging economies. But we have to work on our differences. And I think what is really at stake here is the Paris Agreement really going to deliver at the end of the day with such a weak compliance system that is in place? But I think the next 4 to 5 years are going to show that very clearly. At the moment, the COP in Glasgow is discussing the gaps in terms of ambition. And if these gaps cannot be closed, I think one will have to go back again and have a look at the international treaty in terms of what are possibilities to make that stronger. And I think that's also in the interest of the United States. As I said at the end, the EU and the US will increasingly face geoeconomic and geopolitical challenges. And we will also see and share the fallout of the climate crisis. And I haven't talked a lot about migration, but it is something that is hitting both of us from the south, whether it is from Central America or whether it is from the Middle East or North Africa or even West Africa. These are things that we are going to face very strongly in the coming years. And I think there is no doubt that there would be a benefit if there were to be closer transatlantic relations, particularly at the federal level on these matters. But I think this is something that we just cannot take for granted in Europe. And therefore, we will have to take that into account when dealing with our partners in the United States. Thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to your questions and the discussion.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Dr. Runge-Metzger, for such a detailed, thorough, and interesting presentation. The floor is open now. If you would like to speak, please raise your hand, and I'll call on you. Raise it with a little yellow symbol and not on the screen. So let me, I think I need to change my screen viewing so that I can see people better here to the gallery. Look through. Okay, I don't see anybody raising their hand yet. So let me begin maybe by asking you a question about the European Union's planning vis-a-vis the United States. You've mentioned that the United States has been a hop on and hop off partner over the years, and that this appears right now to be a sort of particularly perilous time with Biden's popularity is falling. I think that what I heard today or yesterday, that his popularity is down to 43%. There's been this election for the governorship in Virginia that the Republicans have won. This doesn't bode well for the midterm elections next year, and then possibly for the challenge from former President Trump. So, when the European Union plans on cooperation with the United States, do they adopt contingency plans? Do they have a sort of if A, we do this, if B, we do that? Is that the attitude of the EU vis-a-vis possible political developments in the United States?
Of course, within the Commission and also within the Council, there is a continuous reflection in terms of what is happening around the world and with different partners, and whether you will have to make contingency plans. I think at the moment what you see, and if you have seen some of the pictures of von der Leyen and Charles Michel and President Biden in Glasgow, it's true, it's very bearish. It's like we are family. So let's dance together and try to push it forward as much as possible. But at the same time, I think there is also a focus on our relations at the lower level. So with the different states, with the cities, for instance, also with philanthropy, particularly the relation with the Gates Foundation has become stronger and stronger. Not only, I think it started very much with the fight against global AIDS, where particularly Europe and the Gates Foundation were pushing forward, but also now in Glasgow, there was a new initiative announced between the Gates Foundation, the European Commission, and the European Investment Bank for breakthrough technologies to be financed in Europe. And that is money that will go straight into, battery factories in Europe or car manufacturers in order to push forward the new technologies in the coming years. And the same is going to be true at the level of the think tanks. I think that work is going to continue in the coming years and will stay at the same strength. Then Europe is trying, of course, to set certain standards ahead of the United States. You will have seen that when it comes to data issues, but in the context of climate change, it is very important when it comes to sustainable finance. When Europe was drafting the taxonomy on what is counted to be green investment and what's counted to be not so green investment, we had a huge participation of the US financial sector in that. I spoke a bit more than a year ago in Boston to a round of financiers there, and I was really surprised how much they knew about the little details that were discussed in Europe and how actively they were participating in each bit of it. So that power in terms of trying to set standards from the EU side and then to count on what some call the Brussels effect is something that we will still pursue in the coming years.
And does the EU seek to strengthen Biden's hand, and should it seek to strengthen Biden's hand?
I think that is what is happening at the present point in time, because what the EU is trying is to support Biden when it comes to being open, take new initiatives with President Biden, also try to get rid of some of the trade issues. What I haven't mentioned is, for instance, the big dispute that was there between Boeing and Airbus and so on. So in order to lower the tensions also, that will be beneficial for both sides of the Atlantic, that Harley-Davidson motorcycles kind of can come in at a lower price is not helpful for climate, but definitely helpful for President Biden's agenda.
Okay, I see that there's some hands up now, so let's go to some of the questions from the public. I'll just say the name that's on the screen. It may not necessarily correspond to your name in reality, but I see Castronovo. Would you like to ask a question?
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I really appreciated your talk. Thank you so much for this. The question I wanted to ask you is, in outlining the possibilities for transnational alliances between the EU and the USA, I'm wondering about if that alliance is going to be targeted, if you see it being targeted particularly at China. And I ask this because every day you can find a story, a lead story in the Washington Post or the New York Times that has something, a sort of negative press coverage about China, whether it's on freedom, whether it's its stance on climate change, its treatment of minorities, its lack of internet freedoms. And so, over the last 18 months, China has really emerged, and probably beforehand, as this kind of major blockage to US ideology. And so I'm just curious how the US and China and the EU might be acting or thinking along the same lines in terms of trying to curb the might of China. And also, what that does, I think that, and what's the subtext here is what that does for sort of, anti-Asian subtext that might have.
Mm-hmm. I think it is, I share your observations in terms of China and what we have seen in terms of actions from the US, but with a very strong alignment from the side of the EU towards China. And I think that the analysis on China in Europe has been changing over the last 12 months. That one really sees more and more the realities in terms of China trying to dominate the rest of the world in terms of the actions they are doing. And that, of course, is problematic on how to deal with that. And I think probably you already also read today this article by a Harvard professor in the New York Times who started to get worried that one should not look at this in a kind of one-dimensional way, because our relationship with China is very close. There is European companies in the chemical sector, even in the automotive sector, that make large parts of their profits today in China because it is just the biggest market. So I think the jury is not out what is the best way forward, and that these three are struggling with each other. You can also see by the fact that Xi Jinping was neither attending the G20 nor was Xi Jinping attending the Glasgow conference. And by the way, also Putin did not attend those two conferences. I think there is a signal of everybody getting back into the snail's house a little bit and reflecting on, okay, what should be my next move? So I think in terms of values and norms, we share so much with the United States. There is no doubt, and there is so little we share with China in that respect. When it comes to the economic relations, probably there is not such a huge difference between the US and the EU in terms of the interdependencies. that were already created. And they were all created on the basis of, okay, China moving into the WTO. And with that, there would also be an open China as a result of that. And that has not happened. On the contrary, what we have seen is that China has been segregating itself, particularly over the last months. Part of it, of course, is also fueled by the COVID crisis. So I think this is going to be a complicated and a complex issue in the coming years.
Good, thank you. Gunther Hellmann.
Well, thank you very much from my side also for a very interesting and informative presentation. I very much agree with your assessment that a lot in the transatlantic perspective, of course, depends on who governs, who rules in Washington and in European capitals. But I was wondering, given that you're well placed in Brussels, to what extent you believe that the EU might become sort of a leader, a front runner in climate policy, irrespective of the kind of American administration that is in place, precisely because it is so volatile when we depend on Trump versus Biden and possible future changes. And in that regard, your example about these financial sector responses to your presentation, I think it was in Boston, is an interesting example, I thought, in terms of trying to look at what kinds of levers does the European Union have. I mean, you mentioned philanthropy, business sectors in general to influence policies, and that there is a lot of probably also parallel movement both in Washington and in Brussels. But I was wondering if we cannot count on the US to come along as far as the governmental side is concerned, what would you see to be the levers where the EU, given its internal differences as well, might actually be a leader in terms of global climate change policy? What areas would that be?
I think first and foremost is that we stick to the guns. So that means while the US was hopping on and hopping off the international negotiations and the international processes, the EU has always kind of stuck to the multilateral process and have carried the other partners around the world during those times when the US was not there. So that was the case when the US walked away from Kyoto. Kind of European leaders were jumping onto the plane in order to travel immediately to Beijing, to Tokyo, to other parts of the world in order to make sure that nobody else is hopping off together with the United States. And that also happened when Trump came into office. Many of the informal processes that were led by the US, like the Major Economies Forum, kind of were taken over by the EU in order to keep on dialoguing, in order to keep on pushing the other countries. And I think we developed quite a close relationship with China during those years and were able to help China in its own policy analysis and to take forward their own climate policy, like, for instance, the introduction of emissions trading. So that is number one in terms of the international side. And then the domestic side definitely is that we just stick to our commitments and we implement, because we need to demonstrate that the whole thing works, that it's not like 20 years ago, and even sometimes today one hears that you can either develop your country or you can fight climate change. But what we are showing in Europe, and the first graph was showing it, is that we can grow our economy and at the same time we can reduce our emissions, and that we will continue to do so until the year 2050 and beyond. So that prosperity can go hand in hand, and that needs a practical example in this world. And that is, I think, what the EU is good at. So it is leading by example. That is an important aspect. And then the other aspect you were mentioning on setting standards globally, yes, that is something that is always on our radar screen, to try to move a step ahead of the others and set international standards. The graph on the car standards shows that very clearly, that we were always at the forefront and the others were following us. In the beginning, it took them 15 years. Now it takes them 5 to 8 years to follow. So that is helpful, and that moves everybody into the right direction. And we will do that on climate finance, as I said. And hopefully we will also be able to do that on this very tricky issue of carbon leakage, where the risk is that this is going to spiral into the same kind of disputes we had on international aviation with other partners, where the US was able to kind of master the support of all the other countries against the European Union.
Thank you.
Terrific, thank you. Now, Frau Kayafa.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank you for your very interesting presentation. And I must say that I have followed with great interest a point that you have highlighted, the difference between EU and US on internationally legally binding commitments. And I would very much like to ask your opinion on whether you think there is hope if one so important part like the US is not really making the way of internationally legally binding commitments for itself, because on such plans that are far goals going to 2050, for example, if one leaves the development so loose without anything binding internationally, I am afraid that, well, things may go, of course, better, but they can go even much worse. And if one thinks that there are countries like Madagascar, for example, that we know nowadays is paying is in front of big challenges because of the climate change, I am wondering whether there are thoughts there to make partners in the US perhaps accept a different way of handling things.
I think that this would only be successful if it would really be possible for the US partners or for the US administration that is in place to get legislation through the Senate and the Congress. So that depends very much on the majorities that you would find. And for the moment, I would just kind of very clearly exclude that. I think even President Biden would not be able to bring major legislation through Senate and Congress. Kind of, we have seen how he was struggling just with the money he wants to spend. He has been announcing in the last days that he wants to, for instance, tackle methane emissions via legislation. Again, here, I think he is banking on the old air quality control legislation that gives him a possibility to do that via the EPA at the level of the agency. So again, it's a legislative approach, but there is basic legislation in place. If new legislation will have to be created, I think it's practically impossible. But the US is not the only stumbling block in that. I think I said that very clearly. Even for China and for India, it's difficult, and many other developing countries, to accept that international law would be more binding than their national law. So I think what we have to push our partner countries is to make sure that a lot of the measures and a lot of the objectives they want to implement, that they do that by national legislation, as we do in Europe. Kind of an international legally binding commitment on its own would not work in Europe. What works in Europe in the end is the policies, is the legislation we are doing in Europe, and where we have very strong compliance mechanisms. So everybody is going to abide and follow the legislation, and we need to help other countries to do something similar. As I said, I think at the moment we are still in the phase where we are wondering whether the Paris Agreement is strong enough in order to deliver. But I think we will see within the next 5 years whether that is something that moves us into the right direction or not.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Sorry, I had an internet connection problem there, but I'm back. Let me just say to the members of the Democratic Vistas initiative that we're not breaking into a second round as we've sometimes done in the past separately, but we're going to continue the discussion in this group. So be sure to chime in with questions or comments at this point if you have them. And with that in mind, I'll call on Johannes Voelz.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation, which had so many aspects that were all very interesting that it's a little hard to decide what question to ask. But one thing that I would like you to address is you started out saying that since the late 1990s in the United States, climate change and climate policy has become a hugely divisive issue. In many ways now, I would even say it's part of the culture wars that is characterizing US politics. Are you in any way afraid, or do you see signs that this may also happen in the EU? I'm thinking here, well, first of all, I'm thinking that it's interesting that you mentioned that US philanthropy reaches over into the EU. That's good, but it's of course not just the good philanthropy that is reaching over into the EU, but there's also, let's call it a populist international that is reaching over into the EU. So what I'm wondering is, listening to you speak, I always get the impression tonight that we can still take it for granted that the EU speaks sort of with one voice, and that there is a very strong consensus. Is that still the case, would you say? Or do we see, if we think about Poland, if we think about Hungary, do we see an emerging bloc where that consensus about climate may be crumbling or becoming less firm?
I think that what we are seeing is, as you rightly say, similar tendencies as in the United States. And as for the reason you have been mentioning, that we have a populist movement, and in that populist movement, climate is being used as one of the divisive issues, as they use the COVID pandemic, as they use many other things, in order to rally support, to get more querdenkers on their side. What I see is that this movement is not becoming strong enough in Europe. I think we have seen in Germany, for instance, in the last elections, that group did not gain a lot, as I think, in terms of people who were behind the party. So it did not become much stronger, except for in certain parts of Germany that have very particular social issues as well that need to be addressed. And I think that is the same in other parts. And when you look at Poland and Hungary, I think both in Poland and Hungary, when you look at the polls there is huge support for climate policies. I think when you see in the press Hungary and Poland making negative statements, I think that is part of the bargaining process that is happening in Council and Parliament. Because while we are negotiating this big package, there's of course also financial aspects related to it. There's revenues that come from the emissions trading system that will have to be distributed. There is what is called the Just Transition Fund that has been created. So the question is, what is the scale of that fund? There is the Modernization Fund as part of that. So what's the scale of this? And this is money that goes directly to Poland and also Hungary. So a lot what you hear from the governments is in particular this saber rattling, this negotiating in the press in order to underline and push your proposal. While I think the Polish society is quite interesting. When I remember back when I was the first time in the mid-90s, sometime in Poland, and I was talking about climate change. It was unbelievable, kind of the discussion that was happening afterwards. Today, and in terms of the average age of the audience was well above my current age. So kind of that is what was the debate at the time. In the meantime, when I go to Warsaw, I have an audience that is so much younger, well educated, very much behind and looking forward towards the modernization of their own country. And they know exactly what they need to do. And kind of, if you look at what is really happening on the ground, look at electric buses. It's Poland that is the leader in Europe on this. If you look at battery manufacturing, it is Poland that will get major investments into their country in the coming years. So I think Poland is very well aware on which direction they want to move, and they want to move into a cleaner direction. There's also the embracing renewable energy over the last years has changed to a large extent. And the same is true for Hungary, where the opportunities are different, but I think it also moves into the same direction.
Great, thank you. I'm taking over the moderation job for now because we lost our moderator. Darrel has internet problems, and he mentioned this beforehand, so I'll just fill in for him until he comes back. And I want to again encourage also the members of the Democratic Vistas group who are here to ask a question, and especially considering that we have people from a broad range of disciplines in the room, I think it would be in the spirit of Democratic Vistas to, go beyond sort of a policy analysis type of discussion and maybe bring in perspectives from other fields. I think that could be enriching. A question that I would like to ask as a follow-up question is, Democratic Vistas is a project that tries to think about challenges to democracy from multiple angles, from sometimes also perhaps unexpected angles. And one can wonder whether we have perhaps potentials in revitalizing democracy from areas that we don't usually think about. And what I would like to ask you is whether climate policy and international negotiations of climate policy, whether there's any potential there to revitalize acceptance and embrace of democracy, both in the US, and in Europe, and potentially elsewhere. Usually we think about it in the other way around. Usually we think democracy, or the lack thereof, is either conducive to getting climate policy forward or not. But can we flip it around and think about climate policy as potentially instrumental to promote democracy?
I think there's various links there between climate policies, but also climate change and democracy. When it comes to climate policies, I think what is very clear to me, having dealt with establishing regulatory frameworks, that you need to have a huge stakeholder buy-in. So the formulation of climate policies in itself, I think, is a democratic process where you need to listen to many voices and bring in many people to have the support for your policies. And quite interestingly, that is the same, and not talking about the US, also in China. It took the Chinese quite some time to move from the announcement of installing an emissions trading system and then actually doing it. And the main reason was that the provinces were blocking, and the companies, the big companies in the provinces were blocking progress. So Beijing had to go out into the field in order to kind of start talking to them, make them understand what is this all about, how does it work, how is it going to function, start with pilot projects that they could shape in different ways in order to see the results. So there was a collective learning process behind that. And I think every collective learning process is also a process that is going to strengthen democracy in one way or the other. Then when it comes to climate change itself, I think the big thing that is a real threat to democracy is, of course, migration. In terms of how are we going to deal with people who now arrive at our borders. And we see it every day at the moment in Belarus. And I'm not saying that these are kind of climate refugees or so. What I just want to say, what is the type of problems you can expect to happen? And that is a big challenge for democracies, where kind of we will have to look into ourselves in terms of saying, okay, what does it now mean to be a Democrat? And I see exactly the same happening on the border between the US and Mexico. Again, this is not just climate refugees or so, but how are you going to deal with huge numbers of people who just want to move to a better place that might be displaced because of catastrophic events. And that is going to be a real challenge for democracies.
Thank you very much.
I'm back again. I'm sorry. Continue to have problems. Can I just follow up on that last point, because I think it's an important one. I think, could it be the case that there may not be an easier time to get cooperation on climate than now? As we begin to see these kinds of pressures, the pressures that you've been talking about just now of refugees, and also the pressures of adapting to climate change. The suggestion of the recent history, at least with the COVID pandemic, is that when countries go into crisis, they tend to turn inwards, and they don't seek international cooperation very much. So I guess what I wonder is, do you think it may be the case that if we fail at international cooperation at this moment, it will only become harder as countries begin to suffer some of the consequences that you've just described? Is this really a key moment in that regard?
I think that this is a key moment, and I think that the pressure is, I think it has never been as high as at the present point in time, despite the fact that everybody knew already 20 years ago that you will only be able to solve the climate issue through cooperation. Unfortunately, I think, in kind of my personal view on that, is that very often cooperation and money is something that gets easily mixed up. Of course, you need money if you want to cooperate. But just looking at the money figure and the number is not the only thing. Of course, $100 billion is not going to solve the climate problem. Much more money needs to be mobilized. The reason to have that number on the table is like a label of you must put and pay attention to this issue. So it was kind of the seed money in order then to have cooperation growing on that basis. But what one will have to look at is, okay, what is really behind how the money is being spent in the coming years? What is the cooperation about, and is it real cooperation that is there that also allows ownership on the side of many of the developing countries, helping them to go through similar processes as we had to go through in Europe, meaning you need to bring everybody on board, you need time, you need to formulate your policies, what's the best way of moving forward. It depends on the political system in the country, the opportunities that are there, the politics of the moment, how to take that forward. So they face exactly the same challenges as everybody does around the table. And I think only through strengthening that kind of cooperation, in the end, we will be able to avoid that huge flux of migration that could happen if things fall apart in big regions in other parts of the world. So I think it is the moment for more cooperation. But that cooperation really has to be expressed and formulated and implemented. And it's not just about, okay, what's the amount of money that is being put onto the table? That in itself does not necessarily mean cooperation. Cooperation is also businesses investing in other countries. And that requires confidence building from the side of those countries. You cannot expect Tesla today to build a factory, I don't know, in Nigeria or so, despite the fact that Nigeria is going to be a big market, because the conditions are not conducive enough for big investments like that at the present point in time. So maybe that was not the best example, but one could certainly find a more suitable one.
There's been some discussion in the international relations literature about trying to build cooperation and also ambition from small groups of coalitions of the willing, sometimes referred to as the club approach, and groups of countries, the EU and perhaps other countries who have a more ambitious vision coming together and organizing within a larger multilateral framework. Do you see any prospects for that? Do you think it's a realistic possibility? Can you imagine the EU playing a role in something like that? And under what conditions might it realistically develop, if at all?
I think that this is already happening, this kind of club approach. For instance, when you look at the creation of the G20, of course, it was kind of at the time when there was a big financial and economic crisis, but it also brought together the main players on climate policies that really need to move in the coming years. And it is a forum where you start testing new ideas on how to take things forward. One of those is, can we at one point in time have carbon pricing in all the countries around the world, and carbon pricing where you see carbon prices converging? And there is groups that are meeting already, like the people in California, the Quebec, from the eastern states, from New Zealand, from Japan, from China, from Europe, where you have systems in place or falling into place, or people are being interested in order to form these types of clubs. Another initiative that was launched the yesterday was this methane coalition. So that's also something where you try to bring people together who want to work on methane. And there's a whole series of these things that have been started already in Paris, with different businesses trying to move forward. So the difficulty with those, many of these initiatives is there is very little in terms of transparency. Are they delivering or not? And what are the metrics they are using in order to measure success? And do they really go beyond announcement? I think in the press it was mentioned with this deforestation pledge that was made, halted by the year 2030, that exactly the same pledge was made in New York in 2014. And the Commission put forward this proposal in the year 2008, where it says reverse and halt in the year 2030. So it is an old proposal, but if you look at the numbers, kind of nothing has happened. On the contrary, things have gone worse. And one of the signatories, Brazil, kind of that is where things really got completely out of hand over the last years with Bolsonaro. So I think that is one of those difficulties with this plethora of little clubs that are emerging in terms of how do you control that you are really moving forward on those ideas. The announcements are huge, and that I think we have seen also over the last phase in Glasgow. Also what philanthropy and big business, big CEOs have been saying over the last days and weeks. I think the proof of the pudding is in the eating.
So is it too cynical then to say that, for example, with the forestry proposal, that this is an effort to try to portray the image of success, perhaps to build upon for maybe more substantive success later in the negotiations of the COP26?
I think it's always good to set objectives, but it's equally important to follow up on them. Some announcements were made in terms of, again, money that would be allocated to activities. Some countries have said they would plant so many millions of trees. So let's see in terms of what is really going to happen. But without happening something, yes, people will get very cynical over time. And you will lose support, public support, to the battle against climate change. And I think that would be very dangerous, because that would reinforce the arguments of those populist sections of the society who still think it's all a hoax and it's manufactured by certain people or groups or sinister movements in order to undermine them.
Thank you. Frau Leudort.
Yes, thank you very much. I have a rather dystopic question for you. Is there a certain point, a certain time, a certain year, whatever, where you would say or could say, well, now it has failed, it doesn't make any more sense, we have to shift our policy from international cooperation to other things? I mean, in the worst case, building walls against refugees and building dams against floods. Or is this, I mean, will it always just make sense to keep on with this process and maybe become cynical with it? Or is there a certain point where the EU would also think, okay, at this point, if it doesn't work, we would have to change our policies a little bit?
I think that some people said that there's no planet B. Kind of in terms of the scenario you are looking at, if this whole thing would completely fail, is a disastrous scenario. And there's no wall that is going to be high enough that is going to shelter you from that. I think you would have to think of relocating to Moon if you do not want to be subject to those drastic changes. So of course, there is an ongoing debate, for instance, in terms of this 1.5 degrees Celsius target. Are we going to meet it? Will we stay below, yes or no? And nobody can really say at the moment. The numbers, of course, say, okay, it's likely 2.7 degrees Celsius. Still, I think it's worth fighting every 10th degree that you can push this down, because the effects are so dramatic that are there. And at the end of the day, if you look at what the transformation is about, what kind of our world will have to go through in terms of investments and changes in the coming 30 years, that doesn't cause any anxiety to me. It doesn't cause any anxiety to any engineer in this world, and it doesn't cause any anxiety to any financier in this world. So the whole thing is doable and can be done. The question is kind of at what pace can we do it? And then at a certain point in time, we will also have to start asking, okay, in terms of our own lifestyles, do we not need to change a little bit here and there as well? But these are questions kind of, they don't need to be answered today. This can be answered during the course of the coming 30 years, and some of the lifestyle changes are already happening. So I'm quite hopeful that, yes, it's no longer the case that everybody needs to have 2 cars in his garage and run around with them, because having them in the garage is fine, but the problem is running around with them. So I think the choice is, in actual fact, is a non-choice. And I think that is what the world is waking up to. But still, if you look across the world in terms of where the debate stands internally on climate change, we are at very different stages. Kind of in Europe, very advanced, even in the US, I think it's very advanced. But in other countries, there is barely a public debate on this. Kind of, even if I would look to the Russian Federation, it's not something that is kind of every day being talked about. I think it's only starting to hit when it comes to the fires in Siberia, but then it's a very small fraction of the population that is affected. And that is the same in many other parts of the world. So we will just have to continue grinding. And we cannot reduce our efforts on this. It's just too expensive not to do it, to leave it aside.
Thank you.
Thank you. Gunther, Hellmann.
Well, I have a question that actually links up with what you just said and the previous question, which is, given the fact that you are, so to say, a participant observer of all these things going on around the world, I was wondering to what extent you believe that the fact that these catastrophes are increasing around the world, around the globe, that ever more people are affected, that we know things will get worse before they get better. Does that affect policies in the respective states? You seem to say, well, if something happened in Siberia, it's local and it doesn't get the attention that it might want. And I would have thought that the fact that, at least in a Western kind of media environment, the fact that we hear about the fires in Turkey, the floods in Germany, the fires and the rains in the US, these things are happening all over the world at the same time and in extreme fashion, that might have an effect not only on the Fridays for Future type people in the streets, but also on governments, in the sense that it's not a collective action problem, in the sense that we have to come together to do something in order for a common good, but our own destiny depends on us doing something now. And I was wondering whether, from your observational point of view, that is visible in how governments act.
I think there is a very strong link here. And kind of, if I look back, for instance, when China was really starting to push ahead on climate policies, is when they had done an internal study of their Academy of Sciences, asking the simple question on, okay, what are going to be the effects of climate change on China? And what they got back from the scientists was so dramatic that they really started changing course, because they exactly saw that it is in their own interest to push forward on this, on climate change, and also start reducing their own emissions. Of course, there's many other reasons why it is in the Chinese context also good to reduce emissions, because it's linked to so much waste of resources. And China will never go where it wants to go if it continues to waste resources at that kind of level, even today. But we see that in other parts of the world. Definitely it has changed the debate in the United States over the last years. That the forest fires in California, in particular the droughts there, but also the hurricanes that you experience on the Mexican coast. I think that is changing the debate also in the United States and many other parts of the world. It is rather unfortunate that people didn't listen to science 20 years ago when the reports were exactly saying that people have to start experiencing it before they start acting. Therefore, I think we are really getting late in terms of our actions, and the risk of overshooting the 1.5 degrees, they grow by the day.
Do you think that climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation pose very different problems of cooperation? I mean, on the surface, it would seem so. On the surface, it would seem like climate change mitigation, countries can see that they have to cooperate with other countries in order to achieve the end that they want, in the ways that you've just been describing. But with adaptation, it's not as immediately obvious. That it looks like adaptation could be more easily conceived of as a national project and not as a project of international cooperation. But again, that might be false, of course, when one thinks about the ways in which countries can be put under pressure by events in other countries.
Exactly. I think the view that you can leave adaptation aside because it's in your own interest to adapt, because if you don't adapt, it's your own property that is going to be affected. That was the predominant view in the past. But I think increasingly, because of the scale of what is happening, people see that this could have major implications across the world, particularly as the first economic sector that is going to be affected by climate change is agriculture. So food production and food trade is something that is going to be affected. So if a country doesn't adapt adequately to the effects of climate change, and it would undermine its own food production, it could put a major strain on the world food system, also in terms of trade. And there's recently some interesting studies that have been done in order to quantify how big that could get. So therefore, it's also in our interest in Europe to see that Asia is adapting to climate change and maybe helping those countries to develop the right methods on how to do that and to do it faster. And I think overall, in terms of the global economy, of course, if there is money they can save by not maladapting to a problem, I think that in general is going to be helpful to the world society.
Yeah, the food system is an excellent example of that. I was thinking only of refugees and immigration, but of course, if there are
So-
crop failures in one part of the world, it can dramatically affect crop prices throughout the world and therefore create problems of hunger and access.
The other area where it is very obvious is water. Because the river cross boundaries, and if in your catchment area you do the wrong thing, you might get to very difficult issues downstream. And even if you think the proper adaptation measure is to capture all the water that falls in my catchment area and not let any water go downstream, you can see the disputes we have on the River Nile. You can see the disputes we have in the Middle East between Turkey and Iraq and Iran.
Great, thank you. We've been going for quite a while now. Are there other questions from the audience? All right, I don't see any. So maybe you could join me in putting that little reaction symbol up and thanking our speaker tonight for this terrific presentation. Dr. Runge-Metzger, this was terrific, and we were very honored to have you. And I think we've all learned a lot from this insightful discussion with you. And as with the last time you were here, it was just delightful to have you. Thank you very much.